Hello, friends. I'm E.B. Arnold of the Candler Foundry, and it's my pleasure to be with you as we do this 4-week study comparing the resurrection stories in the four Gospels. While certainly today we begin with the smallest and the first Gospel to be written, the Gospel according to Mark, I want us to talk for just a moment first about what faith in the resurrection looked like before these Gospel stories arrived on the scene. That's right. Before the gospel stories were ever written, there was already faith in Jesus' resurrection. They didn't have the story of how it happened. Faith in the resurrection prior to the gospels being written was simply that it had happened. The Gospel of Mark was the first to be written probably around 70 CE, but before that, the primary teacher that we have on the resurrection and its significance is the Apostle Paul. Paul's letters predate the Gospels by several decades, and in his letters, we find a very rich and robust faith in the resurrection. Paul writes in Romans 1:4 that Jesus was declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by resurrection from the dead. In other words, Paul is saying that we can identify who Jesus is and was clearly simply by his resurrection. Paul writes later in Romans 4:24, "It will be reckoned to us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, who was handed over to death for our trespasses, and was raised for our justification." That's indeed a robust theology of the resurrection right there. In fact, Paul is saying that it's not Jesus' death by itself that has justified us before God, but actually the righteousness that we are endowed with by God comes from the resurrection, from the newness of life that Jesus was handed after having died. In fact, Paul goes on to say in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Christ had not been raised, our faith is futile and we would still be in our sins. Wow, that's indeed a big statement about not just that the resurrection happened, but its significance of why it's absolutely vital to our faith and our understanding as followers of Christ. Finally, in Philippians 3:10 and 11, Paul writes that he wants to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the sharing of his sufferings by becoming like him in his death. If somehow, Paul writes, I may attain the resurrection from the dead. Notice how Paul structures this. He says, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. Resurrection for us comes first. And it's that power of resurrection, that God being with us in even beyond the grave. I want to know the power of this resurrection so that I might share in Christ's sufferings and be like him in his death. I want to know the power of resurrection so that I can live the crucified life of Christ and somehow also attain resurrection from the dead myself. This is a very rich theological conception of the resurrection. So even though Paul doesn't know anything about an empty garden tomb, Paul doesn't know anything about angels being there when Jesus is raised from the dead. Paul never mentions the women who were there to anoint Jesus's body. Even though there's no resurrection story, there is certainly resurrection faith. And that is a very important and vital thing for us to understand. That the first and foremost thing that the early church believed about resurrection was not how it occurred, but that it happened. And the fact that God had raised this Jesus who had been crucified from the dead made all the difference in the world. So now that we understand that, we can move into what it is that the gospel writers are trying to get us to see by telling a story about the resurrection in their own unique ways. The first thing we do need to remember is that each of the gospel stories is its own unique composition and written by its own unique author. So it's really important that what we're understanding is that we're not getting necessarily what's meant to be a police report of the events that transpired decades and decades before, because remember, the time of Jesus on earth is in the late 30s CE, and the Gospels aren't written for another 30 to 40 years after that. Each of these Gospel writers is writing a unique telling in their own perspective of what the resurrection meant, that there's meaning in how it's told, not just in what the facts or what the circumstances are, but in the way that those things are put together. In other words, all of the gospel writers, to a certain extent, have different and similar ingredients, and so they're all going to have different and similar recipe outcomes. Some are going to have certain elements that the other ones don't have, and they're all going to have certain aspects that are in common. So what we can be assured when we look at these resurrection stories is that they will all have some common themes, and they will all have their own distinct and unique flavors. Another thing that we need to remember as we read these resurrection stories is that each one of the Gospels as a whole presents a distinctive portrait of Jesus. So not only is the whole story of the Gospel and therefore the story of the resurrection unique, but each one of the Gospel writers is attempting to craft a portrait of Jesus for their particular community. This is a very helpful way of looking at this. For instance, if I had people in my life who were each going to give an account of me, who were going to describe what I'm like, well, the portrait that you might get from my 3 children would be somewhat different than the portrait you would get of the students that I teach at Candler School of Theology. And that portrait would also be very different from the one that my husband might describe for you. So it's all good news that we have these different accounts of the resurrection, different accounts of the gospel, and very different pictures of Jesus, because this is a manifold of witnesses, all pointing to the resurrection and saying it matters, all pointing to Jesus and saying he matters in a way that has changed the world forever. So don't be dismayed by the fact that there is differences between these stories and between the Jesuses that they portray as being raised from the dead. And finally, remember that each of the Gospels is written to and for its own audience. Because the Gospel of Matthew is written to a predominantly Jewish Christian audience, its Jesus actually takes the portrait, the shape, if you will, more of Moses than we might say of John's Gospel, where Jesus will look different being written to a different audience. So, all of these things to be told remind us that the Gospels are actually written, the word gospel is good news. And so it is appropriate that the good news, the resurrection of Jesus, would take different shapes and different forms so that it can be proclaimed to as many people and as many audiences as possible. So with that being said, let's dig in to Mark's account of the resurrection story. And I think you will find it's a rather strange story. Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices, so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man, dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He's not here. Look, there's the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. What a very strange story. That is the original ending of Mark's resurrection story. It's a mere 8 verses. And it ends with the women running away and not telling anyone. So the first question I'm sure that's on everyone's mind is, then how did anybody know about the story? That's a great question. And unfortunately, we'll save it for last today. So let's begin with the other questions that we might have in mind. The first one being, who is the young man? Now remember, they entered the tomb and they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side. Now, Mark is a very terse gospel. He only has 16 chapters, and the resurrection account only has 8 verses. So with that very slender telling, Mark doesn't waste his words. And it's important that we actually pay attention to each one of those phrases. That he is a young man in a white robe in the tomb on the right side. First and foremost, this is not an angel, because Mark knows the words for angels. In Mark chapter 1, when Jesus is being tempted in the wilderness, it says the angels attended him. That word angelos in Greek is present. But here at the tomb, there is no angel. It does not say that they saw an angelos dressed in a white robe, but they saw a young man. This word in Greek is neoniskos, and it only occurs in one other place in Mark's gospel. It's kind of a funny story. In Mark chapter 14, verses 51 through 52, the sadness of the betrayal of Jesus in the garden is somewhat lightened by all of his disciples running off and deserting Jesus. And Mark writes, a certain young man, a neoniskos, was following Jesus and wearing nothing but a linen robe. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. It's a somewhat humorous story that this young man, in his effort to get away from following Jesus, literally runs right out of his clothes. That's the only other neoniskos, the only other young man that we find in Mark's story. The one who runs away naked and exposed. But this young man is dressed, covered in a white robe. Another one of the phrases that we see here is that this young man is in the tomb. Now, there was also another man in a tomb in Mark's gospel. In Mark chapter 5, verses 2 through 5, Mark narrates the story of Jesus going to the other side of the lake of Gennesaret. And Mark writes, when Jesus stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived in the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain, for he had often been restrained with shackles and chains. But the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. This is, of course, a man possessed by many demons named Legion, whom Jesus would heal and would actually restore to his sanity and to his home. But notice again that this man, this neoniskos, that's sitting in the tomb, he's dressed in a white robe, unlike the naked young man that ran off. And even though he's in the tomb, he is in his right mind. He's sitting. He's not breaking chains and bruising himself. And he's having a perfectly lucid conversation where he enlightens the women. He's not howling and acting as if he has no control over himself. And so the question is, with these other contrasts, another man in a tomb, another man running off naked, what could this young man be? Well, that's where we get to the particular phrase of he was sitting on the right side. Baptism in the early church actually had the baptism candidate would be stripped naked, walk down into the baptism waters from the left side, symbolizing leaving the sinful earthly side of oneself and being buried with Christ in the water. After the candidate was baptized, they would go out on the right side, where someone would be waiting with a white robe to cover them in, symbolizing their status as a new convert, one who had come up out of the waters of baptism. You can actually see in this slide, you see a picture that's depicting Jesus in his baptism by the early church. And you'll notice it's on the left side where John the Baptist is, and a dark brown earthly robe, right? Darker colors. On the right side of the river, where Jesus will exit when he's finished being baptized, we see angels holding white robes in order to cover the new baptized person. That's what I believe Mark is trying to demonstrate to us, is that the person who's telling the story of Jesus being raised from the dead is a baptized, believing Christian, one who has been converted, one who has come to the faith. It's not an angel in the sense of a divine being, but it is an angel in the sense of one bearing a message, one bearing the good news. Now, another thing that we might be wondering is, why do the women run away? It seems like this is such good news, they would want to go tell everyone. Well, the women run away because the pattern that Mark has demonstrated throughout his gospel is that everyone in the story deserts Jesus. In Mark chapter 3, verse 21, Jesus' own family, his mother and brothers, desert him. They try to actually dissuade him from doing his ministry, and Jesus actually distances himself from them because of that. In Mark chapter 14, Judas betrays Jesus. At the end of Mark chapter 14, all the disciples, including the naked man, run away. The religious authorities deny Jesus any justice. And in Mark chapter 15, the Passover crowd, the one that had cheered his entry into the city, also deserts him. The women are actually the longest to hold out. They stay with Jesus all through the crucifixion and come back even to anoint his body. They are the epitome of faithfulness in the story, and even they, in the very last sentence, leave. This pattern that Mark has set up is that everyone sort of disappoints Jesus. And it leaves the reader wondering, who can be relied on then to relay the message? And like I said, we'll get back to that right before we end. Another question is, why do the women say nothing to no one? Again, it seems like they would want to go tell the disciples. It seems like they would want to broadcast it to everyone. Well, this is an interesting and highly ironic thing that Mark does. Mark's gospel has what is famously considered his secrecy motif. Mark, from the very beginning, throughout the literary telling of the gospel, wants it to be kept a secret that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, this is hard to do when you begin your gospel by saying, this is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So the reader understands who Jesus is. But inside the story, everyone wants to keep it quiet. Well, not everyone, just Jesus. Interesting. In Mark chapter 1, it says that Jesus was in a synagogue, and there was a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth?" But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." Because the man said, "I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And then the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of the man. And everyone was amazed and kept asking one another, "What is this?" Mark writes later that Jesus cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out demons, but he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. And we might think that he doesn't want people to associate him with the demons, that like if the demons know him, then people might think that Jesus is evil. But that's not the case, because Jesus performs series of miracles. In Mark chapter 1, he heals a leper. And after he heals the man, he says, "See that you say nothing to anyone." Later in Mark chapter 7, Jesus heals a man who is deaf. And as soon as the man is able to hear and is able to start speaking, Jesus orders him to tell no one about what happened or who performed this miracle. Even Jesus' disciples are very much dissuaded by Jesus from acknowledging that he's the Son of God. It says that as they were coming down from the mountain where Jesus was transfigured, where his earthly appearance sort of gave up for a while and his divinity shone fully. After that happened, it says they were coming down the mountain and he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. And so they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. Very interesting. He wants it to be quiet. Don't tell anyone I'm the Son of God until after I've been raised from the dead. That tells us that there's something that happens between this transfiguration and Jesus being raised from the dead that will make all the difference in how we understand what Jesus' identity is. I think we get our final clue in Mark chapter 15, verses 37 through 39. Jesus is on the cross. And Mark writes that Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." That is the only time in Mark's gospel that Jesus is called the Son of God by any of the characters in the story, and Jesus and no one tells them to be quiet. Because for Mark, Jesus' identity as the Son of God is very intimately and exclusively related to Jesus' death on the cross. It was important. The secrecy motif basically tells the reader, don't mistake Jesus as a miracle worker for being the Son of God. That's not what makes him the Son of God. Jesus being a teacher or a prophet or a healer doesn't make him the Son of God. The thing that makes him the Son of God is his willingness to die on the cross. And so, as Mark has written this secrecy motif in it, telling everyone to be quiet, the ultimate dramatic irony is at the end, when we now know Jesus is the Son of God and have license to speak it. The women say nothing to anyone. Oh, the frustration that builds up inside the reader. The reader. The reader. The story ends not with a bang, but with a whimper, trailing off in mid-sentence. Yes, you heard me right. Mid-sentence. Mark is not only a terse and rough gospel, but he's a rough writer. And the very last verse in the Greek text of Mark actually ends on the word for, or maybe we could even translate it because. So, he literally ends the gospel in the middle of a sentence. It's not finished. And for so long, so many New Testament scholars thought that Mark was just a poor writer, that he didn't know what he was doing. But when we really stop and think about it, about how the reader has experienced the text, how the reader has experienced the story, I think that it's in our best interest, and certainly more engaging and inspiring for us to read this as a very purposeful ending. Mark leaves his gospel unfinished. After all, no one in the story who's been with Jesus, even the women who stayed the longest, are willing to carry the message and continue the mission. Is there anyone else who might still be faithful? There has been an observer who's been with Jesus in every scene. And you're right, if you guessed it. It's you. It's the reader. Now the reader stands at the brink of the incomplete narrative in which everyone else has failed. And with this terrible restraint, the narrator breaks off the story and leaves the readers, who may have thought the story was about somebody else, with a decision to make. So, what do we get now? Who is left? Who is left to see? Who is left to tell? It's the reader. Just like that man who told the women, he isn't here in this place of death. He has been raised, and he is going to see you again. He's gone ahead of you to Galilee. He'll see you there. That same role is played by a believer, someone who knows how the story goes, someone who has been died and raised in the waters of baptism. And so that means that we as the community, we as the readers, we take on that same role that we see that young man dressed in white sitting on the right side. We have been handed this unfinished story and told to go finish it, to tell people he is not in these places of death. He has been raised. That same Jesus that was crucified, that Son of God who demonstrated his divinity by being willing to die, is now alive. It isn't the task of the women in the story. It isn't the task of angels. It is the task we have. It is our job. And now that the women have run off, the stage is empty, and the only person who knows what's going on and knows what to do is you and me. Now that's another interesting thought, because even Jesus isn't there. There's no Jesus. Did you notice that in this resurrection story? We don't see Jesus. We just get a message delivered by this young man. Donald Jewell, a New Testament scholar, writes this about why Mark doesn't give us this ability to see the resurrected Jesus. And I think it's very interesting. Mark's gospel, writes Jewell, forbids precisely that closure. There is no stone at the mouth of the tomb. Jesus is out. He's on the loose and on the same side of the door as the women and the readers. The doors in Mark's gospel are emphatically open. The curtain of the temple has been rent asunder, and the stone is rolled back from the tomb. God is no longer safely behind the curtain. Oh, that gives me goosebumps to think about. We don't see Jesus. He could be anywhere. What I think is particularly interesting also about Mark's gospel is if you ever look in the historical church artwork that's done on the gospel, the four gospels were assigned various animals to be their symbols, the emblem of that gospel. And wouldn't you know it, Mark's is a lion. God is no longer safely behind the curtain of the temple. Jesus, this bounding lion of a Messiah, is no longer safely on the road or safely in the tomb. He's out on the loose. He could be anywhere. There's a certain amount of risk, a certain amount of jeopardy in following this enigmatic Savior. This Jesus and Mark's gospel as a lion reminds me of C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the person, the character of the Christ figure, is portrayed by a lion named Aslan. And this is a conversation that two of the characters have about this particular king. He is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion." "Safe," replied Mr. Beaver. "Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good." That right there, I think, captures why we don't see Jesus. We are meant to feel like it's not quite safe, but that it's very good. And perhaps if Jesus is out there, and he could be anywhere, perhaps we're meant to go looking for him as we go to share the story of the fact that it is this Jesus who was crucified, is God's Son, and God demonstrated that by raising him from the dead. I hope that you are blessed this week in our look at the resurrection story of Mark. May it be good news for you. And join me next week when we look at the comparative story as told by the gospel writer Matthew.